Well, thanks so much for joining us here today. I always love having you join us, and we really strive to give you as much value as possible because I know how valuable your time is. Today, I think you're going to really enjoy our conversation. We're chatting with Debra Parker Oliver about negotiating the labyrinth of terminal illness. Sadly, all of us reach a stage typically where we're dealing with someone we care about who is facing that, if not ourselves. And I thought it was worth tackling that subject. So thanks, Debra, for being with us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And those of you who don't know her, Deborah is the Ira Codner Professor of Research and Supportive Care at Washington University. She's got a Master's of Social Work, a PhD in Rural Psychology from the University of Missouri. And she was also a hospice social worker and administrator in 3 hospice programs for over 20 years. So she comes to us with a lot of background and a lot of chops. And after getting her doctorate, she continued with that commitment to the improvement of hospice care through research. She's done over 200 peer-reviewed articles. That speaks volumes. Let me tell you, it is not easy to get those out there, predominantly related to palliative and hospice care. So lots and lots of credibility behind her. And I was wondering, what motivated you, Deborah, to do this kind of work? It can be quite challenging, I imagine.
Yeah, originally I got involved in hospice actually because of the death of my stepfather. I was 18 and he died suddenly, and we had to make the decision to withdraw life support.
Oh,
And that was 1978, right about the time of the Karen Quinlan controversy. And so our family had had many discussions about what is quality of life.
yeah,
And but of course not expecting that we would have to make those decisions.
yeah.
So I became fascinated with the topic while in college, and one thing led to another, and
Yeah.
it's what I devoted my life to.
Wow. And it's funny, even though you didn't expect it to happen, I suspect you were leaps and bounds ahead of most people who don't even have those discussions at all, right? About what you would want to have happen. And if you don't mind, can you share your experience with your husband? Sort of the choice you both made rather than the traditional hospice experience really caught my attention.
Yeah, so my husband was diagnosed with nasopharyngeal cancer, which is behind the nose. It was already at stage 4, as that disease usually is, because it's kind of a hidden disease until you get a lump in your neck.
Mhm.
And he taught geriatrics, gerontology, and I had been involved in hospice care and end of life care forever. And suddenly we were in the midst of what we taught. And luckily for us, that meant that we had some knowledge. And rather than fight on the battle of cancer, we decided that we were going to live
Yeah.
and try to knock off as much as we can. We would aggressively fight symptoms, and we did that. And but always weighing the idea: do the symptoms outweigh the risk and the side
Yeah.
effects that they happen to have? And through that process, learned very quickly that hope is a whole lot bigger than how long you have to live.
Yeah. I love that choice. I think it's a brave choice to make. Most people don't take it, and the more I read and saw, and the sort of the YouTube that you guys were doing, I mean, I think it's a gorgeous choice to just choose to embrace life. I mean, so many people spend their last days or much longer in hospitals, in hospice, with virtually no quality of life whatsoever. So what a beautiful choice to make. And as we're navigating these, though, for all of our listeners out there, I mean, there are turning points, there are sort of some obvious, some surprising. Are there any tips you have on how we can anticipate those turning points when we're dealing with terminal illness?
Well, that's the big question, because nobody warned you about what those turning points are.
Yeah,
And no one gives you a map
yeah,
on how to navigate that whole process. I use the analysis of a labyrinth because a labyrinth has turning points. And in retrospect, I can see where those turning points and those decisions are,
mm,
but that's only in hindsight.
yeah,
You walk into that journey without a guide, without knowing what is to expect, and the whole entrance into that journey, whatever the disease happens to be, is a real scary one, and filled with all kinds of tests and unknown options, and a lot of fear and a lot of unknown terminology.
yeah.
And then you reach a point where you have to make a decision, and that's certainly a turning point.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're not even offered a decision. Sometimes you don't get a choice. You have to remember we always have a choice.
Yeah.
Do you do chemotherapy, for instance, or radiation therapy, or do you not? And there are roadblocks along that way trying to make those decisions. And how you decide then determines which direction you go in the journey. And should you choose treatment, and we did an initial course of treatment, then there are various different blocks along that way and turning points. Do you continue? Do you
Yeah.
stop? So on and so forth. And then you wait. After you go through treatment, you wait. You wait for it to come back, quite frankly. And even if it doesn't come back, you're still waiting to see if
Yeah.
it comes back. And if it does, that's a turning point again. Now what do? You get a reoccurrence.
Yeah.
You go back again. Same kind of decisions. What do you do about that? And if you choose not to do treatment, then you got to choose palliative care or hospice care. And then ultimately, of course, you're in the center of the Labyrinth. It's death. And
Mhm.
how do you deal with that? And as the surviving spouse, you got to get back through again.
Yeah.
And same thing, many turning points and many decisions along the way.
Yeah. And we don't talk about it enough as we are such a death phobic society. And I'm thinking, my mom passed recently this year, and at the end she was in hospice. And you don't think even around death, there are so many choices to be made just about that one transition, so many things that we didn't have the discussions about in any meaningful way. So, it's funny when you were saying about the labyrinth, I was almost picturing those mazes, the big cornfield ones or hedges where you just literally can't even see around the corner and you're going in blind, and I remember that angst even as a kid sometimes feeling like, oh, if I'm trapped. Now, any tips on how to manage those transitions then so you can avoid that kind of angsty feel?
The interesting thing is the healthcare system is not always encouraging of questions either.
Yes.
And you don't know what questions to ask
Yeah.
because you don't have enough information. As a researcher, that's where I was lucky because I hit the internet in a big way and asking a lot of questions. And sometimes I had to be, let's say, really assertive
Yeah.
and force
Yeah.
whatever healthcare provider we were with to answer questions and to take that time. And worse, there are some questions with no answers.
Yeah.
There are no right decisions. The decisions are what are right for you. But certainly understanding the options is really important. And it's interesting how different providers have different perceptions of what options are.
Yeah.
And our lovely oncologist, his option was chemotherapy, and he didn't want to see any other
Yeah.
options. Why would you not do that?
Yeah.
And my husband would say, because I don't want to be puking my guts out forever. But we can solve that. Well, you didn't. I
Yeah.
still had some problems. And my goal is to travel. My goal is not to be sick.
Yeah.
So how can I do that and have chemotherapy? And he's like, well, but if we hadn't negotiated that
Yeah.
and had that conversation, we had a radiation oncologist. We were supposed to give a speech and accept an award in England. And we were all excited about it. And he's like, we can interrupt your treatment and then you can go do that. And then you can come back and you can have treatment. And David said, but I'm not having any symptoms. We solved the problem. I think I'll go do that and come back and not have any treatment. And he goes, well, you can't do that because I can cure you. And he goes, oh, wait a minute. Let's talk about that word cure,
Yeah.
because I don't think you've got a Nobel Prize, and that's what you would win if you cure cancer. So what is your definition of cure?
Yeah.
And he said, well, my definition of cure is that you go 6 months without any sign of the tumor. And he goes, understand that's not Webster's definition of cure. And it's not my definition. My definition is it's over. It's done.
Yeah.
I don't ever
Yeah.
have cancer again. Certainly longer than 6 months.
Yeah.
If I get more therapy, I have more side effects, and that doesn't equal cure to me. So it really is a negotiation with the healthcare system around what you want, what your choices are, and what to be expect, and what they know, and how they interpret it into English for the
Oh,
rest of
I'm
us.
I am so glad you said that because I always call those negotiations, right? And as you were saying that, it was
Absolutely.
reminiscent of, my daughter had to have open heart surgery as a baby and spent 3 months in critical care, and I was every day in 100 ways a day negotiating and advocating. And more recently, one of my sons had significant mental health issues. Of course, during COVID in the hospitals, it was a constant negotiation about every aspect of his health care. So do you have any secrets that you would share in how to get your physicians to listen as part of that negotiation?
It's interesting. They call that negotiation, which is a really nice term for it. Interactional suffering is another term
Well,
where every interaction you have is exhausting
yeah,
and you're suffering,
yeah,
even from the very people that are supposed to help you.
yeah,
And getting them to listen is three-fourths of the battle.
yeah,
Doctors think in PowerPoint slide bullets.
yeah,
And so you have to go in armed with your bullets, and they have to be very succinct and very to the point.
yeah,
Not about how you feel but about the facts. And then your questions need to be very pointed questions.
yeah,
But all that requires being prepared
yeah,
and doing some homework before you go. And that is exhausting, right?
yeah,
Especially if you're in the midst of doing caregiving in the
yeah,
process. But the more prepared you are and the more direct you are, the better they're going to listen
yeah,
because they're trained in 15-minute intervals.
yeah,
That's how long we train our medical students that an office visit is.
yeah,
And in that time, they've got all these things they need to do.
yeah,
Well, to get your little agenda in, get it in quick
yeah.
and be distinct.
I'm cringing as you're saying that because I'm just thinking about, 30 years in the legal profession as well. Like we bill in 6-minute increments. Everything is a point
Yeah.
one. And so many lawyers, I'm embarrassed to say, I think most lawyers, they don't listen as well, right? So I mean, it's not just our medical, everything is in, out, this assumption that they know more, of course, than whoever they're dealing with, with the patient in this case. So now let's talk about the grieving process for a moment, because I mean, obviously it starts before the death in these cases where you're dealing with a terminal illness. And again, do you have any insights, Deborah, that you can share on how to negotiate living with the anticipatory grief, for want of a better term?
You know, I wish I had magic bullet hints. I can tell you my mistakes,
Okay, that helps to
and
know.
here I am, I'm knowledgeable and have been in this business for a long time. And I wish I had not spent so much time in anticipatory grief. It was so hard that you can get caught up worrying about the anticipatory
Yeah.
grief and missing out on some of the living
Oh,
in the meantime.
yeah.
And I kind of had hoped that maybe the more anticipatory grief I had, that the less grief I would have. As though there were this infinite bowl, and it's like, okay, I'll borrow some now
Yeah,
and it'll make it less painful later. None of that is true.
yeah,
None of it is true. And anticipatory grief is something we live with, and it's hard, but it doesn't soften anything, and it really doesn't accomplish a whole lot, quite
yeah,
frankly. And I spent a lot of time with that. You also try to hide it. My very best friend was the one dying. My husband was my very best friend, the person I told everything to, my confidant. And you certainly couldn't tell him how horrified and how
yeah,
upset and sad you were. He
yeah,
was dealing with enough of his stuff.
yeah.
So I lost my husband and I lost my very best friend
Oh,
to talk about anticipatory grief. So then you think, look at your world. Who else can you talk to? Well, the answer is nobody wants to hear about that,
yeah,
right? It's really sad.
yeah,
And everybody's afraid that they're going to go through what you're going through.
yeah,
And so learning how to cope with that on your own is tough.
yeah,
And good practice, though, for what comes later, because grief is sadly a very similar
yeah,
experience. The best thing that happened to me was finding somebody else who's going through the same thing
yeah,
because they understand they're going through the same thing. And
yeah,
that's where social support and social support groups are incredibly
yeah.
helpful.
Although powerful advice, Deborah, when you said like when you started out and said about one of the mistakes you made was sort of living in that space. And I assume that's one of the reasons you guys just chose to travel and enjoy life and live every moment and experience as much joy as you can while you still have the opportunity to to do that. I think that's beautiful advice. And I love that you're not sugarcoating. You're not saying that's easy to do, but that in hindsight, it's the better choice of the options. And you talked about the challenge of talking to people. And I mean, people are so awkward when dealing with someone on these issues. You know, we said about it being so death phobic, and when someone's diagnosed with a terminal illness, nobody seems to know what to say or do, you know, how to negotiate what used to be really simple relationships. So again, any suggestions you have for knowing sort of what to say when it feels like there's nothing that you can say?
You know, the subtitle of my book is called The Love Grief Equation, and we have a YouTube video on that. And what that means is the more you love, the more you grieve.
Yeah.
And grief is kind of the price of love. And part of the way to get through that pain is to focus on the love part. And the love part of the equation is
Yeah.
what my husband would used to tell me. And so that means focusing on the positives, the positive stories.
Yeah.
And one of the greatest things that someone can do is give you the gift of listening to stories, even if they're painful to tell,
Yeah.
even through the tears. Ignore my tears
Yeah.
and focus on the joy I'm trying to convey, but I'm having a hard time.
Yeah.
And even saying to things like, I know this has got to be really hard to tell, but I love hearing how much love
Yeah.
the story contains.
Yeah.
And that helps me remember the love side of the equation.
Yeah.
But as soon as tears start, we feel bad for this person and we want to help them stop crying, not let them continue, or maybe make them cry worse.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what people need.
Yeah.
Somebody to let them cry and have it be okay and still hear,
Yeah.
I'm sad, but there was a lot of good stuff too.
And that love, it's such a powerful antidote. As you were saying that, I was remembering years ago now, but a client of mine who was, you know, too young as always to be dealing with it, and he was dying of cancer. And I went to visit him in the hospital, and it shocked me. And I walked away just feeling so uplifted because he was surrounded by family, and everybody was joking and laughing. And as you say, sharing stories. And as I was getting ready to leave, they said, stay and hear the whole, this big Italian family all kind of descended on the hospital and set out buffet tables. And we're having this massive traditional Italian feast with laughter and it was such a beautiful gift to see that, such a perspective shift. I thought it was great. And how about at the other end of this perspective? Like, how would you best negotiate breaking bad news? You know, is there a secret recipe or any kind of recipe for telling people you love that you have a serious illness?
You know, there really is a recipe, and we actually teach that to medical students. And we do that with the hope that it can happen in a good setting.
Yeah.
Too oftentimes, bad news has to happen in this day and age over the phone,
Yeah.
which makes it even more difficult. But in an ideal world, you're in a comfortable setting, and that is paid attention to. And I'm not standing at the door ready to leave like our physician was, but I'm sitting down with you
Yeah.
and I'm looking at you eye to eye. And maybe even I'm within the distance that I can reach out and give a loving touch of understanding and pay attention to my body language. And again, the phone is a big disadvantage, and we have to
Yeah.
be cautious about that.
Yeah.
The first thing we encourage people to do is to say something they already know. Like, as you know, we were going to run this test and see what we can find, and we were looking for. That sets the tone, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then saying, and we do what is called fire a warning shot. You
Mhm.
say, and I'm afraid it didn't turn out as well as it might have.
Okay.
So now my body is like, uh-oh,
Yeah.
I'm not
It's
quite as surprised.
preparing.
And then you wait a second. Silence is an okay thing.
Yeah.
Let that absorb for a second.
Yeah.
Anyway, and even 1 second is a long time.
Yeah.
So you fire the warning shot, and then you kindly say, the news isn't good. This is a stage 4 tumor, yada, yada.
Yeah.
Again, stop, pause, let it sink in, and say, But I want to assure you that we are with you all the way,
Yeah.
that you are going to have support and understanding, and you're going to be okay.
Yeah.
We will make you comfortable. You got to give some kind of hope
Yeah.
in the midst of that. And then how can I answer questions
Yeah. Well,
and give people time?
yeah.
And we used that approach when we broke our news to our kids.
Yeah.
That's baking bad news. I mean, it doesn't have to be a doctor to a
Yeah.
person. It's we break bad news of all kinds all the time.
Yeah. Well,
And at least recognizing and offering some empathy, and most importantly, that people don't feel stranded and deserted and alone
yeah.
in the news is important.
That was a great answer. Holy smokes, when I asked for a recipe, I didn't expect you literally to have one laid out for me. That was
Yeah, I mean, there actually is one, which is
yeah,
amazing, and we should teach it to everybody. It shouldn't be this
absolutely.
top secret thing, right?
Well, and not just for this situation, but as you were
Right.
saying that, I thought, what a beautiful negotiation model when you're having a difficult conversation. I mean, that human connection, which we have lost. Everybody's doing everything by phone or email or, even Zoom, where it's different, as you say, than being able to reach out and have that touch, which I think is so important to decide the where of any difficult conversation or
Right.
negotiation. But I love that you focused on the power of the pause, right? To give people the opportunity to process. We're terrible in North America for not
Mhm.
listening, rushing everything through, and not allowing people time to just acclimatize to a new thought or a new reality. I think that was a beautiful answer. Thank you. So tell us about your book, Legacies from the Living Room.
Well, my husband actually had written an ebook of his journey from his perspective, and
Yeah.
before he died, he said, "You're going to write a book too." And I'm like, "No, I write professional papers and I've written some essays, but I don't intend to ever write a book." And I would do a lot of speaking about my experience, and
Yeah.
people wanted a book, and they said, "But have you written this down?" And I'm like, "Well, no." And so then I decided to give it a try, and writing a book is very different than writing
Yeah.
science.
Yeah.
And so it was a very therapeutic process.
Yeah.
But I share from my perspective and from my family members' perspective,
Yeah.
because I had someone else interview all of our grandchildren and our children, because this is a family disease.
Yeah.
And it was a family process. We embraced the family and just very rawly told the story, including the emotions that come with it and the choices we made. We decided early on to make this a teaching experience. As I said, we were both professors. And it was like, if ever there was a chance, an opportunity to teach, this was it.
Yeah.
And so we made these YouTube videos, which at the time that actually was pretty innovative,
Yeah.
and we fell upon it by accident. And I described the role that those YouTube videos made, because they made us think about not just what we were experiencing, but what did we learn from it?
Yeah.
And what can we teach others
Yeah.
about that? Which kind of made you think a little positive as well.
Yeah.
And I followed that through part of the grief as well on the subtitle component, and shared the legacy letters, that some of the legacy letters, my husband left letters for everyone,
Oh,
and shared some of those. So those are in there. And I suggest anybody that has the opportunity to leave such a gift to their family
yeah.
do that, because those have been so helpful through our grief. So
Yeah.
it's just a raw memoir of what happened those 42 months plus into bereavement, and how we managed to get through, hoping
Yeah.
that it first lets people know they're not alone
Yeah.
and they're not the only ones going through it. And secondly, maybe we've got some advice in there that can be helpful to people.
And what a gift, because my gosh, Deborah, the way you guys handle it, just, I mean, even the letters, the legacy lovers, like, oh my goodness. And did you find, you said about writing the book was therapeutic. I know for myself when I write, especially about anything personal, it often surprises me that I get insights, personal insights that I was not conscious of. Did you have that experience?
Oh, every word
Yeah.
makes you really think and feel. And there are many tears in between
Yeah.
all of that. Many, many tears.
Yeah.
And then I would go back and read it and I'd feel better. And
Yeah.
then I'd go back and read it again and go, Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, okay. That makes sense. So writing is an iterative process, and through that you're forced to relive what happened
Yeah.
and tell it in a logical way when the process may not have felt so logical at the time,
Yeah.
and explore your feelings at the time and where you are now. And that's good. That's a great
Yeah, and
experience.
sometimes our subconscious surprises us, and as we write, it percolates up. Like I know when I've done it, I've found suddenly resentments that I wasn't even aware I was harboring, right? And suddenly they're there, and I'm like, whoa,
And
reading it back
I
over, going,
journal.
yikes, where did that
I'm a
come from?
journaling person, and so I had journaled along the way.
Yeah,
I never dreamt I would ever share any of that.
yeah,
But
yeah,
when I couldn't find anyone to talk to, I talked to my paper and I wrote it
yeah,
all down. And the value of going back and reading that is what helped put the raw emotion in,
yeah,
because that was
yeah,
where I was at the time. And time didn't change that or distort it in any way because I had the words already there. So I strongly recommend writing and
yeah,
journaling as a way to get through it, regardless of what you ever do with it.
yeah,
Getting your thoughts on paper is as good as spelling them out to anybody.
yeah,
And there's no reason to be anything but honest about
yeah.
that.
Well, we're certainly glad you did, and obviously it has resonated. I know the testimonials and the reviews of your book are exceptional. So kudos to you. What a gift to the world as well. And thank you for being so honest and open and transparent in this conversation. I really appreciate it. And our time's gone so quickly. I normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts you've had in your life? And it doesn't have to be about this. It can be something else at some point where you had an aha moment that caused you to show up differently or think differently. What would that be for
That's
you?
what a powerful question. Throughout my husband's dying process, I kept saying to myself, if it's this hard for me,
Yeah.
how hard is it for someone
Mm,
else?
yeah.
And the number of times as a social worker, as a hospice
Yeah.
person, that I had tried to normalize somebody's feelings, that's different than understanding them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I learned is that living is really a valuable experience and gives you a whole different insight. You can understand the book of it, you can understand the logic of it, the theory behind it, but until you've lived it,
Yeah.
you don't get it in the same
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, and where can people learn more about you and your book, Deborah?
Amazon, any retail outlet like that, Legacies from the Living Room, The Love Grief Equation, and all the information is there.
Beautiful, beautiful. And for our listeners, and we'll make sure to put that in our show notes. So don't panic if you didn't get that down. And also, I always encourage people, go to your local bookstore as well. Go to those independent bookstores and ask them to get the book in. It's always a great boost for an author, and it's a great way of, sometimes having a ripple effect for the book than when you're hit those smaller locations as well as the big box stores. So
Agree.
yeah, well, and thank you so much, Deborah. This has been such a lovely conversation on a difficult topic. So I really appreciate you coming and sharing with us.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, and for our listeners, I'm sure there is just so much beautiful value here, very heartfelt, practical, and emotional kind of roadmap, if you will. Make sure to give the gift of sharing as well. Share this episode with other people in your life because we all end up having to deal with some sort of grieving process at some point in our life when tragedy strikes, and whether it's for ourselves or loved ones around us. So please make sure to subscribe and make sure to share as well with anyone that you think could benefit. And before we sign off today, as always, just quickly want to share some ways if you are looking to uplevel your negotiation skills so you can negotiate a better life. I've got everything from group to my signature mastermind and VIP experiences as well as online. It'll help you better leverage your innate power so you can get more of what you want and deserve in life. And if that sounds interesting, check it out at artoffemininenegotiation.com. And if you haven't got a copy of my book yet, please do so. My goodness, it's been out now for a year, so no excuses. Art of Feminine Negotiation, How to Get What You Want from the Boardroom to the Bedroom. And that's a wrap for this episode. Until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.